Hello, everyone. Welcome to our panel discussion today. We're really excited for this panel. We have some outspoken leaders from across the clinical trial ecosystem who are eager to help discuss accountability for diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical trials. This project is being brought to you on behalf of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Digitized Clinical Trials project teams. On the right, you can see the logos for our project partners. The goal of this project is to improve and increase diversity, equity, and inclusion in the trial design process. I know many of you are new to DE&I, so I want to take a minute to give you a quick introduction. My name is Yashoda Sharma. I am a program director at the Digital Medicine Society, or DIME. DIME is an educational and research professional society. Our mission is to advance the ethical, effective, equitable, and safe use of digital medicine to redefine healthcare and ultimately improve lives. We are about 3.5 years old. DIME launched in May 2019. The hallmark of our work comes from learning and collaborating with experts from across the industry. These expertise are also reflected in our strategic advisory and scientific leadership boards. We are proud to say that we deliver clinical quality work on a tech timeline. There are 3 pillars to the work we do at DIME, starting with community. DIME partners and experts from across tech and healthcare collaborate to address some of the greatest challenges and opportunities to advance the field. We conduct research and develop resources that are action-oriented and evidence-based to tackle some of these challenges. We take our role as communicator and educator very seriously. All of our resources and our publications are open source and are available to stakeholders from across the ecosystem so that we can all work together to advance digital medicine. DIME sits at the intersection of healthcare and technology. Historically, these entities have existed in silos. With the advancements of digital health technologies, we know that these entities cannot move forward in isolation. The purpose of DIME is to bring these communities together so that we can learn from each other and together advance digital medicine. And this is why we're all here today, to learn from the different perspectives, these different industries, to advance digital medicine. A quick housekeeping note before we get started. Today's session is being recorded and you will have access to the slides and the recordings from DIME's webinar page. We invite you to be an active member of this discussion. There are a couple of ways you can participate. You can raise your hand using the Zoom reactions, and we will invite you to come off mute and give your question live, or you can type your question in the chat box or the Q&A box. All right, so let's get to the fun part. It is my honor to introduce Jonah Comstock. Jonah is editor-in-chief at Pharma Forum, and he will be our moderator today. Jonah, can you please come on screen and introduce our panelists?
Hi, my name is Jonah Comstock. As Yashoda said, I'm editor-in-chief at Pharma Forum. If you're not familiar with us, you can check us out at pharmaforum.com. Very thrilled to introduce to you our panel this morning. We have a mix of stakeholders from across the clinical trial ecosystem, representing pharma, researchers, startups and tech companies and patients. So I will actually let our panelists introduce themselves. I'm going to ask everyone to come on one at a time, give your name, your affiliation, and then really quickly, and we're trying to get through this because there are a lot of us, really quickly say one thing you or your organization is doing to promote diversity and equity in clinical trials. So let's just go through in the order I've got them in, and then from that slide. And we'll start with Del Smith from Acclinate.
Yeah, good day, Jonah, and we appreciate the opportunity to be here and be part of this esteemed panel. My name is Del Smith. I have the pleasure of serving as the co-founder and CEO of Acclinate. Acclinate is a digital health company specializing in accessing and engaging communities of color so they can make informed decisions about clinical trial participation. And to say one thing that we believe is significantly important for this topic of diversity in clinical trials would be that we need to move to a non-transactional nature of engaging with our diverse communities and not take an approach where the first time we interact with our diverse communities is when we want to actually ask them to be part of a trial. And that requires a level of sustained engagement with our communities in order to build trust and to know when is the appropriate time to present an opportunity to take part in the trial. I think that's tremendously important. So again, happy to be here.
Love that. Yeah, I know. We'll talk more about that. Let's go to Ed Ramos.
Thanks, Jonah, and appreciate Dime putting on panels like this. It's important to surface these conversations and discussions. Ed Ramos, Director of Digital Clinical Trials at Scripps Research, co-founder of the Digital Trial Center there. I also sit as the Principal Science Officer at Carevolution, which serves as our technology partner for a lot of the research platforms that we've launched. With regards to how we've leveraged the decentralized digital clinical trial, we've really kind of embraced its underlying concepts around really being able to bring the clinical trial, the clinical research study out of the brick and mortar clinic, such that anyone anywhere can participate. We feel that much of the issues around diversity and representation are centered on access. So the ability to really reach various different populations through use of tools like digital health technologies and the decentralized trial design has really been at the forefront and core of how we build up a lot of our research efforts. So excited to dig into that, and very happy to be here with my colleagues.
Thank you, Ed. We'll go next to Ingrid Oakley-Gervin.
Hi, thank you so much, Jonah. So I'm SVP of Research, Value, and Strategy at Medable and the Executive Director of the Medable Institute. I'm also affiliated with Stanford and the Public Health Institute, which is a nonprofit that runs a cancer registry in California. So I think part of what, at Medable, we're a SaaS platform for remote and hybrid trials. We provide solutions and tools within that SaaS environment to facilitate enrollment, communication, features that establish trust. I think we just heard someone say, you really can't just, what we used to say in the public health space was, you dive bomb into a community and then you run out and leave as soon as you get what you want. And that doesn't really work. So, this is a way to help improve things like the alliance, the therapeutic alliance between the clinical team and the participants so that trust is established. And we work on that. I've published some stuff recently and I can share those links in the chat. But I think, thinking about the psychosocial and cognitive and behavioral aspects of participating in a trial, as well as, the physical access and what pieces you can do, those are all important components that, from my side and as a researcher and a scientist, I try to embed in our SaaS platform to make it more than just a technology. It's an approach that I hope, ends up really sort of cocooning people when they're in a trial and providing them with that additional kind of feedback and care and tending to make them feel, rewarded about participating in a clinical trial or getting healthcare, whether it be preventive or a service once you have a condition. Those are the types of things that, I think about and that we think about at Medable.
Thank you, Ingrid. Next up is Michelle Reed from GSK.
Hi, that's my name, Michelle. I'm responsible for our global demographics and diversity at GSK. So all of our clinical trial diversity across all of our vaccines and all of our medicines, and to some degree interacting with our counterparts at ViiV as well. Our take on things from a sponsor is really to stick a fork in the process that we're in. I love hearing what Del and Ed have been describing. You know, we can't just show up and ask. We really need to set things earlier, and it's, to some degree, there's some build it. If you build it, they will come, but they can't come if nothing is built in the first place. So that's what we're doing up front.
Great. Our patient representative on the panel is Ricky Fairley, the CEO of Touch.
Good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. I guess it's now afternoon in my world in the East Coast, but I'm the CEO and co-founder of Touch, the Black Breast Cancer Alliance. I'm so excited to be here and do this work with you guys. I love these brilliant conversations we have every week. You show, I'm so happy to be a part of these conversations. Black women are dying at alarming rates of breast cancer, a 41% higher mortality rate. The statistics are horrific. And what we've learned is there's a growing body of research that's validating that a Black breast cancer cell looks different from a white breast cancer cell. And until we advance the science and get drugs that are tested on Black bodies, we're going to keep dying. And so we are on a mission to eradicate Black breast cancer and educate Black women about clinical trials. Our data shows that the level of health illiteracy in the Black community is horrific, and people just don't know what they don't know. And so we want to make trials accessible to the Black community by any means necessary. And I believe the digital outreach could be a way to do this. And so we're happy to do this work with you guys and find some solutions that are going to get better science for Black women.
Thanks so much, Ricky. Next is Raquel Ricadio, Director at Amgen.
Hi, everyone. I'm Raquel Ricadio. I'm Global Director of Representation and Clinical Research at Amgen, which is a large biotech organization and industry sponsor of clinical trials. I co-lead a team at Amgen that's fully dedicated to improving the diversity and representation of participants in our clinical trials across our portfolio, but especially those that have been historically excluded from research due to race, ethnicity, sex, age, and other factors. I have had over a decade of clinical research experience and also in public health, where my research has really always focused on disparities in healthcare access and health outcomes. And what we're doing at Amgen that's really trying to move the needle is that we have a team of experts that's dedicated solely to this issue, which makes us, I think, unique across the industry. There are some other companies that do this as well, but it really shows Amgen's focus and dedication to the topic because we have a team that's fully dedicated to this since 2020 and sponsored at the highest level. The other is that I bring up my public health background because we're really trying to embed the principles of community-based participatory research throughout the clinical trial lifecycle, especially putting patients and their communities in the driver's seat as early and as often as possible.
Great. And last but not least, Sam Eels from Lightship.
Hi, thanks for having me here today. I'm really excited to talk about this topic, and it's something that's really important to me. And I guess like a few of the others on the panel, I also have a public health background. And at Lightship, we're really focused on creating access and choice for people so that they have a way of taking part in studies that fits their needs and their preferences. So we offer solutions like people being able to take part, whether it's in clinic, a mobile research unit, at home, through telemedicine, and having all the tools and support around them to make it easier for them to take part and have that access and create that choice in how people do join and stay in a clinical trial. And for us in our mission, what we believe that will ultimately do is help increase equity in clinical trials. And I also think it's been really important to work with lots of the partners, like folks that are on this panel, as we grow and think about how we do our work, because it does take all of us in the ecosystem to do it. So thanks everyone for having me here.
Thanks, Sam. Thank you all. Great answers there. And we are ahead of schedule after the intros, which is good because I think it'll give us a little time to impromptu go off script as we need to respond to each other and make this a real conversation. For my part, I think the clinical trial space is probably one of the most interesting stories in pharma right now. And I think that the combination of the digitization of clinical trials that sort of got sparked along by COVID and this this increased focus on this question of diversity, equity, and inclusion, not only as a social issue, but also as an issue of doing good science. It's just been fascinating to watch and heartening. That said, despite all the kind of guidelines and recommendations aimed at improving this diversity, it's hard to find the measurable progress right now. And it's hard to see that all populations are really being included. So first, I want to talk a little bit about that. We'll start with Ed. From where you're sitting, Ed, what do you see as holding up this progress in biomedical research, despite recommendations and guidance from federal funding agencies like NIH? What are the forces driving prioritization that can help, or what's getting in the way of progress?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, first I'll say that, I think of all the topics we'll discuss today, these really aren't silver bullet answers. These are holistic solutions that we need to recognize require input from so many different aspects of diversity, equity, and inclusion, each of which in themselves are umbrellas and that need to be teased out and broken down. But specific to your question, I think part of it is recognizing that one, in and of itself, viewing this as a social justice moral issue should be enough to fuel our desire to really move the needle on representation. But in addition to that, it absolutely can be data driven. And so it can be frustrating sometimes that the data does exist to support the need for prioritizing DEI and representation. So for example, I often turn to genome-wide association studies on the heel of the Human Genome Project when we were examining mutations associated with a variety of different diseases. The first several hundred of those studies were focused on populations of European ancestry. When you think about the birthplace of humankind, the focus just from a scientific perspective, the argument easily could have been made for focusing on sub-Saharan African populations and global ethnicities beyond European ancestry. And so it's an opportunity now that we have with decentralized digital clinical trials in which we're presenting a new paradigm to really prioritize in a different way that we haven't in the past. And again, we can do this from a social perspective, and we can do this from a data-driven perspective in terms of looking at health disparities and prevalence of diseases and disorders across populations. We really don't have to go far to get an understanding as to which populations and communities we should prioritize. And so the last thing I'll say, just to try and leave a bit of an action item here and a specific, recommendations are helpful. They're guidance, and they really kind of set the tone in terms of where we're going. I think the gap is what happens when research groups fall short of those recommendations, or sponsors fall short of those recommendations. It can't be a cliff. There needs to be a bridge there in terms of education. Well, I can't move forward because I can't access these populations. Well, why not? What are the tools that we can provide you to help you access those populations? Well, I can't get that data because I can't bring them into the clinic. Well, why not? What technologies can you use to potentially access the data that's necessary for the types of research questions that you have? So it needs to be this back and forth of, look, this is where we need to drive towards. But if you can't get there, what are the tools and resources that we can provide to help educate, to help inform and fill those gaps that allow for that?
Great. And in a moment, we're going to talk a little bit about some of those tools, digital tools, some of the tools that folks on the call are working with. But I wanted to give Michelle a chance to give us sort of the pharma perspective on the same question. What do you see as holding up progress, despite the recommendations and guidance from FDA and other organizations? And, how empowered does your organization feel to go ahead and make progress with where we are now?
Well, I mean, the very real notion and the excuses that have been used in the past are, well, there's money on the line. If supposedly people who are not white, we have historically not had to work very hard to bring into our studies, if I take longer, that costs more money. If I wait too much time and my drug doesn't get into market for a certain day, you know, I like to say a blockbuster in the marketplace is risking $30 million a day for every day that that drug is not on sale. So you can imagine there's a lot of perceived pressure of wanting to close the studies. But now we're actually having the opportunity to have the conversation and explain that that's not true in a lot of cases. There are a lot of misconceptions and misinformation around the challenges of bringing in people that we have never brought in before into the studies. And so dispelling some of those myths, you know, to Ed's point about being data oriented, we bring data in order to prove those points and say, look, this is not true. This is a misconception. Let's show you what we mean. And then ultimately, just putting our foot down and saying, look, there's reputational risk, there's scientific risk, there's ethical risk in not including all the people. And now we're able to actually show epidemiologically. You know, I heard, you know, Ricky talking about the nature of different types of cancers and so on. Now we have that data to prove the point that scientifically this is really important. And if we can center on the epidemiology and produce those populations and have subpopulation analysis correctly, this is really the only way to do it. There is no other way.
And Ricky, why don't you finish this section off for us and tell us a little bit about, you know, what's the patient perspective on this? What does this really look like for people who are dealing with a condition like breast cancer, this lack of access to clinical trials?
So imagine standing on a bridge or a cliff and looking down at a body of water and thinking about jumping in to save your life, not to die. I mean, it's really fear of the unknown. And our data shows that we've talked to a lot of Black breasties. We did a research study 2 years ago. And we talked to 300 women, and it's fear of the unknown. It's thinking about, are you going to jump off that bridge to save your life? Because you're going to go into something that you have no idea what it is. And that fear, basically, and then you add on the level of earned medical mistrust that's in our community from the history of, you know, Black people in science. So you have all this fear going on, but it's really because they don't know. They don't understand what cancer research is all about. They don't understand what standard of care is. They say stuff like, I'm going to get the sugar pill and die. And there is no sugar pill in cancer research. So, but that fear of the unknown is so pervasive that they can't get over the barrier of trying to jump into it. And then also, they're not talked to by doctors. Doctors don't invite them. And so if you're not invited to the party, right, and then you don't really know there is a party, you don't even know what it is, and you're afraid of it, it creates all kinds of havoc. But what we've learned is if you educate them from the voice of trust, which is probably another breastie like me, I'm an 11-year survivor of triple negative breast cancer. And so when I talk to a breastie, it's a different conversation than the doctor has or the researcher has. So my voice of trust, you know, God forbid I'm the trusted voice, but that voice of trust, I can convince someone to do a trial in 5 minutes with a simple explanation of what standard of care is, that what it means, right? That Advil you took last week for a headache was in a clinical trial. That medicine you gave your dog was in a clinical trial, with just simple basic information without using big words, without, you know, using scientific explanations, but breaking it down to simple language that women can relate to, and they get it and they want to play. So I think it's really just how we talk to people and using what I call cultural humility to have these conversations. And it's really just educating from a voice of trust. And so we actually started a movement about 6 months ago called When We Trial, and I'll put in the chat whenwetrial.org. And we basically built a website for breasties, by breasties, about breasties, with breasties. And we changed all the pronouns. So instead of going to Dr. Google and seeing stuff like you and they, it's all about we and us. And it's all a lot of video content of Black women. So I can go see someone who looks like me and teaches me and educates me about what a trial is, how it works, but also teaches me how to ask for it because I'm not being asked. So we've now signed up 5,000 Black women into clinical trial portals since May, because we're just talking to them in a different way. And it works. And people want to do it. People want the science because they don't want to die.
That's incredible. And it's really great to be working this problem from both sides, right? If they're not going to be asked to participate, let's help them to ask to participate, right? We're getting some questions in, which is great. And I'm excited to get to the Q&A portion. I'm going to save the questions for the end so we can make sure everyone gets a chance to chat during the panel portion. But please continue to send yours in as you get them. Okay, I'll do one quick question now, Ricky. Someone chat just wants to know the name of that website so they can look at it.
Whenwetrial.org. I'll put it in the comments.
Great, thanks, Ricky.
Thank you.
So let's talk a little bit about how digital health technology can help to alleviate some of these clinical trial burdens. In particular, some of the burdens around participation that are placed on the clinical trial participants and on the site staff. We'll talk a little bit about sort of the digital divide, how we design the technologies and how we design the trials. So let's start with Sam. Sam, how do we design technologies that help increase equity and technologies that don't create more disparities?
Right. So, when we think about technology, it has completely transformed the way we do clinical trials compared to 10 years ago. And it will continue to as we get more tools and get more familiar with the processes and technology changes and grows. But what we don't want to do is leave people out or leave people having a harder time because we haven't spent the time upfront in a design phase to think about how is everyone going to use this? How do we make this technology available, accessible, easy for every user? And think about the individual person and how they'll be using it based on, who they are and where they are. So when I think about technology and designing it for a study, there are probably 3 components that are most important. And that's really building in the planning time and effort and people around you at the table to think about it. Also, the next is sort of really getting patient insights, feedback, caregiver, family member insights if it's a study where you're going to have other family members involved. And also thinking and planning for the infrastructure support that you need when you're using that technology, whether it's, from a hardware perspective, a software perspective, what do the people using the technology need to support them in their journey across that trial? And so some of the things that I've seen, particularly in the planning stage, is just thinking through the processes, the workflows of how are people going to get this technology? How are they using it? What could go wrong? What backup plans do you need to have in place should people need support or their phone breaks or their internet goes down? And I think we can learn a lot from that. And this, also ties to some of the how do we engage people earlier is really with those patient insights and, showing them the technology, letting them use it, getting their feedback, and also understanding who they are and where they are in their journey, so that we can be more inclusive. So thinking about, for any individual person and how you're using it, we may need to think about the language we're using, making sure it's culturally relevant, making sure people understand how to use it in the interface. We all can have different types of issues with our internet. Do we need, a hotspot for people? Do we need to give them a device versus using their own? Thinking through things, even bandwidth. I think we all learned a lot about bandwidth during the pandemic and how much of it we may have available at any given time. And that is going to vary for different people. And I think also thinking through getting that feedback from people about how they want to be engaged. Do I want to have someone to call, or would I rather text someone or email them if I'm having a challenge with the technology? So really getting a feedback from the people in the communities that you're going to be working with ahead of time so that you design that technology really well, I think is important. And then sort of the last piece of it that I think is really key is that we're all learning. So continuing to get that feedback, not just once you design a platform or a technology, but continuing to get feedback from people along the way and iterating and making it better as you go on to the next study or think about your future, changes in what you're building.
And Ingrid, what about trial design?
Mm-hmm.
So Sam talked about design of the technology, but how do you design the trials to make sure that the use of technology is ultimately promoting equity?
Yeah, I think that's great. And Sam, I fully agree with what you said. And those are all the things that I think about as, a former PI myself, and as an epidemiologist, right? This representation, like Raquel, I've spent, most of my public health profession dealing with and trying to address disparities, right? Being, really shocked and dismayed by some of the outcome differences, and how do we address that? So I think also about social determinants of health, having lived across the US in many different types of communities, and in healthcare desert areas as well. How do we deliver solutions in a trial design that would then be feasible for the to represent the population with that condition? Because I think that's the key piece that we're getting to. How do we make sure that this molecule, medication, drug intervention will work for all the, across the board for the people that have the condition? And that's what Ricky's kind of been speaking to. Do we need to include things like genetic screening, reaching out to communities to make sure that that piece is done first, so that we know if that target drug is really going to potentially be effective for them, making sure we include social determinants of health, which can impact your epigenetics, which of course then down or up regulates proteins. So I agree with Ed that I think part of it is also designing a trial where you utilize the data that you capture to make sure that you will have a representative sample, so that you can have some security in knowing that the results, right, will be reliable across the different populations that have that condition. I do think, getting back to some of the points about how do you communicate, what types of communications do you need? And Sam mentioned that as well. I think that's something like where televisits, is that availability going to be used by everybody all the time? No, there'll probably be a different frequency, right? People need different ways of interacting, but we should include that as an option to make sure that the clinical team and the participant and their families, right, caregivers, can have those interactions with the clinical team to make sure that they're understanding all the components that, are supposed to be involved, right? If you're completing e-pros, for example, can you use some nudge theory data analytics to assess which communities or which participants are responding to a more frequent nudge versus a less frequent nudge, right? People are different in their behavioral and health literacy and technical literacy backgrounds, right? So also providing things like resources that they can always access without, having to go to the clinical team, right? Can that just be embedded in, say, the mobile app that you're using to collect the e-pros? I think that's a really important piece. And we found with some of our NIH funded work at Stanford, Duke, and Kaiser that that's really well received. Right. There's also ways that you can help reduce participant stress. So if you're telling them, this is this set of symptoms are the ones that the clinical team wants to know about, and they're going to be looking at this data, then the participants feel what they enter is meaningful. And the clinical teams can then see that and reach out if they're seeing an alarming trend, a change in the intensity of some symptom that might then, be a precursor to an adverse event, for example. So there's different ways that we can think about doing this. But I do think that the data piece is really important. Using behavioral concepts like nudge theory, embedding more videos in e-consent so that they're friendlier. They help to improve health literacy about the trial. So, to Ricky's point, there's a lot of people that aren't necessarily understanding standard of care, what could be achieved in a clinical trial. And these are, if we pull this all together and we can present it to both the clinical team, the site, right, so that they're also feeling confident about using the technology and engaging with the participants in that way, I think that's really critical.
Thank you, Ingrid. And we'll close off this section with Del. Del, regulatory guidance on digital and clinical trials is still somewhat in flux, and that's sometimes cited as a reason not to pursue it, right? It's too uncertain, it's too much risk. What's really going on? How is regulatory guidance sort of affecting or not affecting the abilities to use this technology in trials? And yeah, what else could be the real thing under that answer?
Well, let me first start by saying what I am not, and that is I am not an expert in regulatory guidance, but I think to the heart of your question, Jonah, I'll give you an example of how I think it applies to what it is that you're getting to. The way that we approach this issue is through separating the engagement that needs to take place, the sustained engagement with individuals from the recruitment process, right? But we tie those two things together. And so when it comes to sustained engagement, we actually have a platform called Now Included. And this is a platform where communities of color can go to be educated, engaged, and empowered about their health. And so it's very similar to what Ricky was talking about, right? It's about engaging with people and using an opportunity for people to hear from and talk to folks that they can relate to and they can connect with similar lived experiences. But through that process, we're able to help understand who is leaning into certain indications and diseases, and to start to make some predictions about who would actually respond if given the opportunity to take part in the trial. So I can say, hey, Raquel, you've been looking at a lot of information on Now Included about X. We think you should know that there's a trial going on in your area that you can take a look at. And here's where you can go for more information. And so it's about educating, engaging, empowering people to be able to make informed decisions about clinical trial participation. Now, when we were engaging with a client, name that I will withhold, of course, they were looking at our Now Included community and saying, we want you to turn off comments. We don't want there to be any comments here because we want to minimize negative comments. And we understand how that plays out in a traditional model of having a platform about recruitment and adverse effects and being able to capture that data in a way that doesn't create problems. But what we were saying is, listen, we're trying to build trust with our community. And if we turn off comments for an engaged community to not be able to talk about the challenges that they're having as they go through their illnesses and their conditions or their treatment of family members, that's not being genuine to creating a trusting environment. Now, what we can do is figure out ways that when we identify which of those individuals may lean into a trial and we give them the opportunity to take part, when they move over from just being engaged to now being potential participants being screened for a trial, that's when the regulatory stuff we understand can apply. And that's out of our hands, right? That's more of the sponsors or the CROs or the platforms issue. But it's an example, I think, of how the industry is still trying to understand that there's a new way of doing this, and that while we want to make sure we stay in compliance, we may have to change the way that we approach some of these transactional based interactions with patients in ways that have it be more relational wise, knowing that we're dealing with people further upstream before they become participants in a trial. They're actually community members, they're actually individuals. So I think that's just the case, an example of how there's still more work to be done to adjust some of our regulatory views to fit with the reality of what we know is most effective.
Thanks, Dal. We're now slightly behind schedule going into our final section before the Q&A. So I'm going to ask everyone to try to be succinct so we can make sure we have time for some of these great questions that have come in. We're stuffing a lot into this panel, so it's not you, it's the ambition of the panel. But I want to talk in this last section specifically about the FDA draft guidance that came out in February to help sponsors develop diversity plans. It's been much discussed, and want to get into it with this group, starting with Raquel, who has, I think, not had a chance yet to talk. By definition, Raquel, draft guidances aren't final and aren't legally binding, but this one has gotten a lot of attention. Tell us why. How can we use this attention to make some progress with increasing diversity?
Yeah, so the FDA draft guidance might be the thing I talk about most often, I think every day, internally and externally, just because it's just something that's come out, more strongly than we've seen, in the past from the FDA regarding this work. We really welcome the addition of this guidance to address the issue. We've already been working on this since about 2016, and also noting that FDA's other guidances for industry in 2016 and 2020 before this draft guidance already were recommending the development of these plans for clinical trials. But this one, is getting more attention, not only within the R&D and healthcare communities, but the general public as well, I think, for a few different reasons. One is that I think because it focuses on and calls out specifically race and ethnicity. In the US and around the world, we're all familiar with the social unrest related to race that was magnified by the killings of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and others. So it really brought to the forefront this discussion about social injustice and inequities that exist from community to community. And the COVID-19 pandemic really highlighted some of those existing and historical racial and ethnic disparities in healthcare access and outcomes, in this case, a vaccine participation for clinical trials. Now, practically speaking, we really have a clear expectation now from the agency and a submission timeline that allows sponsors enough time to appropriately design and plan an approach to enrolling a representative clinical trial population. For example, the FDA proposes to integrate diversity action plans as part of the existing FDA submission process, which is super helpful rather than having a standalone separate document. And also giving this very specific timeline that we submit that before end of phase 2 is an appropriate point in the drug development process for this activity, because the updates are permitted as long as additional information becomes available. But in general, it's really a strong message, right, from a regulatory agency that equity in the development of new medicines is critical, and it's no longer a nice to have, but is now really a serious consideration throughout the medicine development lifecycle, and also highlights the message that driving toward equity in research means giving all stakeholders really a major role in changing how we've conducted research in the past. And that includes patients, caregivers, we're talking about that quite a lot, providers, communities, government, industry, and others. So we really think that this draft guidance spurs our own organization, but also the industry and the ecosystem in general to talk about the issue more broadly, and more importantly, to work together to take action to evolve the way we've been designing and running our trials in the past.
Thank you, Raquel. Ryan's just dropped in the chat, which I think everyone should be able to see, the comments from DIME on this draft guidance. Some organizations have commented, not DIME, others, that diversity plans should be kept internal instead of being formally submitted to the FDA and being public. So Del, what are your thoughts on this? How would an internal only plan affect efforts to increase diversity?
Such a loaded question. We've had an opportunity to actually interact directly with the FDA about this guidance, as I'm sure many people here have as well too, to kind of understand what was their thinking behind this. And I don't want to err on the side of summarizing something that is not the intent of FDA, but I'll tell you what we heard from our interaction with FDA was that it's a general approach. And I talk about this. I was dean of a business school, HBC, before starting Acclinate, and it was similar. We had an accreditation agency that came in and said, here are the standards. We're not going to tell you how to do those standards, but you have to show us that you've met those standards, and you come up with a plan to do that. And I perceive what FDA doing as being very similar to that. They're saying, listen, we have an outcome we want to get to, and we know that we have to have a different outcome. But industry, we're going to allow you to come up with what the plan is in order to meet that outcome. And I think that people are responding accordingly. But I think also that there's going to be a point in time where people are going to assess the actual outcome data and say, have we seen significant movement? And if we have not, then there's going to be another call of action to the industry to say, whether it be an internal plan or whether it be a public plan, whatever the plan is, it either is or is not working. And so I think I've seen very positive response from industry in my short time kind of being involved and seeing groups like Raquel and what they're doing at Amgen and other sponsors who are building teams, making this a priority to make it happen. So whether the plan is public or whether it's private, the question at the end of the day is going to be, what does the data look like from your particular company and from the industry? And we'll know at that point.
Thanks. The draft guidance says that sponsors should set enrollment goals based on the epidemiology of the disease across diverse racial ethnic populations, or in the absence of that data, they should leverage various data sources, i.e. published literature and real world data. So Ed, how do we reconcile this guidance with the large gaps of missing biological data for many populations and the many accounts of racial biases with the use of AI to analyze real world data and large data sets?
Wow, lots in there. So we'll pick it apart a little bit. But to the first part, I think it's great that there is this flexibility in appending data beyond just epidemiological data. But now the question is, what exactly does real world data mean? And to what extent does it need to be validated, and how robust does it need to be? So circling back to my kind of earlier comments in terms of this give and take of the regulatory bodies and sponsors, really having an understanding of what can be brought to the table. The notion, so that being said, at a high level, I think there's plenty of epidemiological data to create a very long list of diseases and disorders that have a health disparities component to it. It's when we start breaking this down and getting nuanced in terms of, let's say, type 2 diabetes, which we know has a health disparity component to it. But are you now looking at severe progression of type 2 diabetes where your insulin require additional insulin? Or are you looking at subpopulations that have just progressed from pre-diabetics to type 2 diabetics? And so that's where you start drifting away from the general epidemiological data that exists to potentially need for more robust data. And so the ability to use things like continuous glucose monitors or other digital health technologies that can allow for filling in those gaps, as you said, really requires an understanding of how receptive will the regulatory bodies be. And so there needs to be some flexibility and some clarity on the regulatory side, as well as some movement on the sponsor side to go beyond just, oh, well, there's no epi data, so I can't focus on this particular population. So the carrot and stick approach, I think, is applicable here. With regards to AI, I mean, we're already seeing the challenges of medical algorithms, for example, in terms of risk-based prediction. So we know that there is concern here in terms of machine learned algorithms moving from statistical model to kind of AI-driven algorithms that could potentially exacerbate health disparities. And so again, this is just another data point to ensure that we have those avenues for real world data capture in the appropriate context for the appropriate populations and communities that we're in trying to lift up rather than to widen the gap with regards to health outcomes. So lots, each one of these themes, I think, could be a panel in and of themselves, to be honest. But I think it really just comes down to what is that next step of beyond epi data really look like? And I think it does exist. And I think there are plenty of groups that could offer up expert guidance on how to include that in the kind of formulaic understanding of how to leverage it.
Thanks, Ed. Ricky, did you want to weigh in on that?
Sure. I believe that clinical trial participation really needs to be commensurate with the burden of disease. And as trials are developed, it really has, the numbers should reflect, you know, how the audience, how the patient audience is impacted. So for example, I had triple negative breast cancer, which Black women get at 3 times the rate of white women. And we don't really know why, because we don't have the science. And I'm not smart enough to do that math, but who's ever calculating the participation levels of patients, it has to reflect that Black women get at 3 times the rate, or it's not good enough. So I think we have to think about all of that, you know, and as we design the trials, and that has to be part of that conversation in how a pharma company is responding to that, you know, to that information, providing information about that specific trial. So I think it really has to reflect how a disease is impacting a specific population of that disease. And I mean, you know, I think breast cancer may be a little different, but I think that when you think about diabetes, what does the incidence and mortality numbers look like for diabetes for, you know, people of color? I'm sure it's more prevalent. I don't know a lot about diabetes. I'm, you know, kind of breast cancer is my lane, but I think all of those numbers have to come into play as we think about designing the trials. And I think earlier I was going to make a point about just leveling the playing field for technology. To me, I call it technology equity should be price of entry. So when you start thinking about what the tactics are for people to be able to participate in a trial, if you don't make the technology have equity across the board for patients, it's not going to work. And if you think about a Black mom, so 77% of Black moms, no disease, are single moms. So when you think about the cell phone that she has in her house, which probably is an iPhone 14, right? But that could be the household computer that her 3 kids are doing their homework on. So I think when you think about providing technology, it has to be equal across the board, and people have to be provided with the technology they need. And we can't just make assumptions that they have what's needed to do this work. And that has to be price of entry.
Great points all, Ricky. Thank you. Excuse me. Ingrid, you've worked internationally, and this conversation has largely been limited so far to the US, or at least centered on it. But of course, this is a global issue. These are global pharma companies conducting trials. And what are the implications for a diversity plan for trials conducted outside of the United States?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I think, from having lived in Africa, one of the things that I observed is that a lot of developing countries have really leapfrogged, landlines, for example, right? They just went straight to some sort of a phone, a digital phone, cell phone type of environment. And so, the familiarity, with using technology is going to differ across the globe. As Ricky said, maybe they're using that single iPhone as the computer for the kids, and that can certainly be, maybe they're using the iPhone for all of their needs in one household. So you do have to think about those things. But I think, as I think about, there's definitely care deserts, right? Either because care facilities are so remote, or ratios between clinical teams and patients is quite different in a lot across the globe than it is in more developed countries. And so I think you also have to think about that. So this, being able to do things remotely, being able to digitize things like a consent form, that can improve diversity, right? Because you're digitizing the whole process, and then you're also collecting this real world data that you can use for global compliance and understanding, who's participating, where are they falling out, and say the consent form, what parts aren't being understood by, given individuals or communities, how can we do better, right? So you create this kind of learning environment with that data that then allows you to deliver information, whether it be technology literacy, health literacy, just understanding about the condition. You can deliver that in a different way once you have that kind of real world data from these sorts of situations. And I think, from my perspective, I think the diversity plans can then also honor some of these cultural aspects that are so important, right? In some communities, having the caregiver kind of lead the decision-making around the care is absolutely essential, right? Some communities would prefer that the patient doesn't even really fully understand everything about the disease, because that's a mental health negative for them. And they would prefer that a primary care person be assigned to the situation. So I think, we have to honor those types of differences as we create diversity plans for trials that would be conducted, in the US and outside the US, right? I think that there's some commonalities here. The US is obviously a melting pot of people from around the world. So we have a great learning environment in itself. And if we could partner as communities, maybe it's Amgen and GSK working together to try to look at what works, what are roadblocks or barriers, and thinking through how could we really solve those for the larger global community. I think that would be absolutely fabulous.
Thanks, Ingrid. Raquel, in addition to the FDA draft guidance, there's also a bipartisan and bicameral Diverse Trials Act in Congress that calls for a clear strategy to diversify clinical trials and recruit more underrepresented populations. What are the implications of that bill?
Yeah, I'm really glad that we're talking about this because I was going to pop in when Del was speaking earlier when we were talking about, policy and the things that affect us, right? Because not only is the scientific community important to driving all of this, there's also the regulatory piece, which we've already talked about, but policy is just as important, especially when we're talking about things in the US and we think about driving them forward. So if people are not familiar with the Diverse Trials Act, it's a bipartisan and bicameral legislation that's sponsored both on the Senate and the House side. And what it does is that it exempts the provision of free digital health technology to clinical trial participants from the federal anti-kickback statute. So if this bill were passed, we'd be able to take clinical trials as close as possible, hopefully to where patients live and work, which we know is an approach that all of you on this call know that can increase demographic diversity in trials. And it includes decentralization and allowing for remote participation of patients through the use of digital technology tools. And we know that clinical trials almost always require participants to report their conditions, symptoms, side effects, and such. And certain health indicators can be monitored by web-enabled technology, as many of you are very familiar with on the call. But for this to work, clinical trial participants have to have access to those technologies, those tablets, the computers, those apps. So this legislation would really take the common sense step of exempting the provision of free digital health technology to participants. And that would include eliminating a financial barrier to participation in clinical trials. So it really creates a statutory safe harbor for patient support that many advocacy groups think is a critical factor for lots of patients, including lower income patients, including racial and ethnic minorities, and deciding whether or not to even participate in a trial. So again, it's really important here, right, to talk about industry and advocacy groups working with regulatory and policy communities to really achieve that equitable health for all by advancing those policies together. So talking about the Diverse Trials Act is important because it's just another piece that helps drive a lot of this forward from a legislative perspective.
So we have just a few minutes before our Q&A. I want to give our last couple panelists a chance to talk one more time. And I want to just ask, so we'll start with Sam. How, thinking in terms of digital clinical trials and organizations that are digitizing clinical trials like you are to meet patients and participants where they are, how would you evaluate diversity plans? What pieces need to be in those plans that reflect that aspect?
Yeah, thanks. So I think some of the things we've talked about, like one, you always in the diversity plan need to make sure you're trying to engage a patient population reflective of those actually living with the condition. And DCTs can help with that in that we can think about different ways of how we break down those barriers of participation by making it easier, more convenient, doing it in a way that people feel safe and trusted. So that's how we think about when we're working with folks on diversity plans. How is the way that we do things or offer them for people as a solution to take part, how can that help increase diversity and match the plans that are being put together for how we want to engage people? So I think it's one of those things where it creates a lot of opportunity, but we have to spend the time thinking about how we're really engaging different populations, folks who have been either underserved or underengaged, or Ingrid, to your point, living in an area where there just isn't access to healthcare, to help increase inclusivity and diversity in clinical trials.
And Michelle, what do you think are some of the efforts needed to have a sustainable long-term plan for the industry on clinical trial diversity? Just to sort of sum up some of the thoughts we've had.
Well, I think it does come down into the regulatory to make it business as usual. Not just in the US, but across the entire globe. And when we're going to see that in Europe, we're going to see that in Asia, and the idea of localizing that to represent the people that are living in these different geographies. And then lastly, to really elevate the notion of the science that we're trying to conduct here. Ed was talking about the real world data, and we see this in the questions as well. If we're talking about interventions, that's definitely, we have some interesting information. There is data that is dirty or not well collected, quite frankly, in a lot of populations, and we have to be aware of that. Also in the vaccine space, it's a little bit inverted. Here in the US, we have our non-white populations are immunizing at half the rate of our white populations. And that's a risk factor that's not really directly related to the disease that we're trying, the epidemiology of the disease. I think COVID was a really great kick to the entire industry and to the entire healthcare industry to understand how do we need to deal with this more appropriately. So I think there's a little bit of a inertia that we are overcoming recently in the last 2 to 3 years. And now with all of the regulatory bodies getting on board to understand how to do that, the draft guidance may never actually go fully, out of draft. The legislation might take over that with the DEPICT Act if we get lucky with that, and everyone will understand what needs to be done. So the idea of equity is really to bring it all to the same level, the appropriately fair level for everyone. I think the last thing I wanted to say here is the technology is not equitable all the time for all people. Everyone will benefit, and that's the beauty of this. Is so for all the folks out there who have not been able to access, who have not been able to achieve that level, they'll get the most help. Everyone is going to benefit from this technology, provided we make sure that it's humanity centric.
Thanks, Michelle. Yeah, Ricky, I wanted to give you one more chance to talk from the patient perspective a little bit about diversity plans and how they should be evaluated.
More birthdays, more weddings, more grandbabies. To me, Black women are dying. So, I don't want anyone to die of breast cancer, but I definitely want mortality rate parity for Black women. And I'm looking for more drugs, better drugs. I want more lives to be saved. So I think, to me, that's the end goal of all of this work that we're doing, is saving lives.
Thanks, Ricky. We did real good on time. So we have about 15-20 minutes for questions. We have several good questions. So far, people have opted to have me read them. But if you want to ask your question live, just raise your hand, and our team will help you out with that. But the first one that came in was not necessarily for, actually, these are all kind of for anyone who wants to jump in. So so this first question is, please discuss how we can use digital technology to move from a transactional relationship that starts when the trial is announced to an enduring, trusted relationship that begins well before any trial and addresses the trust, socioeconomic access, educational, and trial awareness needs of communities of color. And of course, that's springboarding off of something that Del said in his introduction.
Yeah, I'll jump in there quickly with my thoughts here. We utilize technology in our day-to-day lives, and whether we're talking about Instagram or we're talking about Twitter or TikTok, which I'm not on either of those last two, by the way. We're utilizing technology, and we have an element of trust in those platforms because it's not that it's giving us cognitive information so much that we're absorbing, but it's reaching an affective element, AFFECTIV, right? An emotional element. And we have to understand, we can use digital technologies not just to get more information to communities that have been historically neglected, but we can use digital technologies to leverage and trigger the affective elements of things as well too. And so the platforms that Ricky's talking about, the now included platform, the way that we are engaging, it's about utilizing technology in very similar ways to draw people in and get it to where at the end of the day, they say, I don't want to go more than an hour without connecting to this community, connecting to this app so that I can learn and hear from and communicate and share my experiences and feelings. And when we do that, I think all of a sudden we start to see much higher conversion rates when it comes to linking it to recruitment and when it comes to enrollment and retention numbers. So that's the real use and opportunity for us with the digital technology that we have not yet fully employed.
Yeah, if I could just quick piggyback on that, this theme of trust obviously should always enter the conversation, but we have an opportunity with digital health platforms to return information and insights back to our participants that allow for transparency. So very specifically, for example, in many of the platforms that we use, when we ask participants to connect their electronic health record data, there are two avenues for doing this. You can do a HIPAA waiver and it's a set it and forget it, and it kind of happens in the background. We have an opportunity to leverage platforms in which can access electronic health record data and then use a data visualization to display that back to the participant. So there's some immediate return in terms of them just having an understanding of what their patient portal even looks like, through participation in a clinical trial. But then also the transparency of everything that they see they now have an understanding of what's actually being shared with the research and study team. And so they have a bit more agency and control over how long they want that EHR data sharing to persist, certain types of EHR data to share or not be shared. And we have an opportunity to do that. They are seemingly small things, but they're focused on very large concepts. For example, building trust and this idea of transparency and the data that's being collected and the data that's being shared back.
Thanks, Ed. Next question. Should there be any ramifications or fines associated on companies who do not have enough diversity on the clinical trials? So we've talked about carrots. Do you guys think there should be sticks?
Yes.
Yes.
I mean, yeah, Ricky's point about breast cancer. I mean, there's some obvious populations here. We look at maternal mortality in this country. For an industrialized nation, we are the worst in the disparity that we have with respect to Black women in and maternal mortality. If you're a company that's focused on maternal health and you're not prioritizing those populations, then yes, we keep talking about where's the data. There are some things that are just so obvious that you don't need to have a rabbit hole kind of journey to identify what the data are. They exist, they're at the surface, they're at the top, everyone knows it, and they should be what's driving prioritization of our studies. So it may be easy for me to say yes because I'm not on the sponsor side, but I do feel like there's an opportunity to have sticks in an appropriate manner.
Well, I mean, Ed, I'll help you out there. So I'm not going to talk about fines, but I will talk about ramifications. And it really ends up being, are you doing the business the way you need to or not? And the companies, I think it'll happen rather quickly. The companies who are not conducting their business appropriately and properly and ethically and scientifically sound are not going to make it very far. And that ends up being the biggest ramification I can imagine. We have already seen in the last year a lack of approval based on not sufficient data. And so that's a massive hit to a forecast and to that company's ability. And hopefully that's a really big signal. There's also a number of organizations and there's a couple sponsor companies out there who did not have the proper populations and basically missed out a massive swath of patients. I'm not talking about a revenue stream at all. I'm talking about access to a population, specifically women who now discovered, hey, this drug that I want to have in my life is not on formulary because I'm technically off label. That was a huge miss. And so that happens across the board, across all of our populations. And those are the ramifications that I think, quite frankly, are far more real than any fine.
Yeah, Michelle, I'd jump in and I'd say, that to me, that raises potential. How could we create lanes for success when the proper representation hasn't been included from the start, right? Because historically we could go back. I mean, we all know about when women weren't included in clinical trials and then cardiovascular drugs came on the market and weren't always very successful in the female population for a variety of reasons. So, we partnered with like CVS, for example, to help improve access at a trusted source where you go to on a regular basis. So it's not something, in keeping with the line of people using TikTok and things, you want to stick with behaviors and approaches that they're already comfortable doing and try instead of adding something new to someone's life, right? So if they could go and the pharmacist would say to them, hey, you're on this medication, would you like to be included in a trial and provide some information about it? That then allows a track for additional inclusion, right, of populations that might not have been represented early on. Because we have, historically lots of drugs that weren't really evaluated in that base population to start with, right? It was a very small segment of the folks getting the condition, right? And then things like if we add in health data, right, we get real world data, we partner with a few like Datavant, Pluto, and I think this is a huge service if we could give that information back to individuals. Who really has all their health record data in one place? Does anyone know? Every time I go and put my kids' vaccination stuff in for a school, I'm like, oh my gosh, here we go again. It's just this scenario where if we could then provide information back to people as a service, right? We haven't even discussed, that beyond the other components that are involved in participating in something. But if we could put those components together, I think we could create, sort of a carrot combo stick, if you will, somewhere in between that would help companies really showcase how that drug works or doesn't work in specific populations. And then those populations would feel represented and that they're contributing kind of, I like this idea of collective impact. Maybe it's my time from the Peace Corps, but this is this idea that do you have a collective impact as a community, right? And having done a lot of community-based participatory research in my years, that is something that is critical, right? And I think we can do a lot better, but we need to create these lanes for success for that.
So, sorry, go ahead, Ricky.
I was going to add, why do we do this work, right? When someone decides to go to medical school or when somebody decides to be a scientist, like, why do we do this work, right? I mean, I know my purpose came from God. My doctor gave me 2 years to live. I'm on 11. So I'm very clear about my purpose, about why I do this work. But to me, everybody that does anything in our space should have their reason for being and why do we do it. And to me, it all starts with the golden rule, what your mother taught you when you were 2 years old. Treat others as you want to be treated. And so when you if you thought about that every day and said, okay, when I give this patient a treatment plan, is this the plan I would expect for myself? Is this the plan I would give my mom, my grandma, my auntie, my daughter, right? Or is this how I would approach it if it were affecting me, if this disease were affecting me and my family? And if everybody just thought about their purpose and reason for being, about why we do this work, we'd have a better health community. And I know that sounds really simple and stupid, but at the end of the day, we all have to take accountability. If we choose to do this work in whatever capacity of it we're doing, we have to take accountability for people dying or people living or people getting better or people surviving. And if you think about that every day and everything and every decision you make, you'll make better decisions about how you do your work. And I think we'd have a better world. So, I mean, I know that sounds like motherhood, but at some point we have to be accountable for results. All of us equally own saving people's lives if we're going to do this work. So I'll get off my soapbox and shut up now.
Well, we have probably time for one more question and then a final closing question. So I am sorry we're not going to get to everybody's, but a really good one that came in was, you've all been working on diversity and equity efforts for some time. What has changed recently to give you hope that we'll finally see some progress in this area?
I'm happy to start. I would say that I think, COVID in some ways did a wonder of good for people to learn to understand and adopt, more remote participation and what things can be done, meeting patients and participants where they reside, where they live. How can we do things differently? I think it really shook things up. So this hybridization or digitization of clinical trial components, I think, is really critical. And I think across the board, everyone seems to understand that, including, regulatory guidance is following suit. So to me, that's one of the most hopeful pieces.
I think from a sponsor perspective, seeing so many sponsors being so transparent about where we're starting from is something very new, I think, in general, from an industry perspective, but also that we're putting, a lot of us, including Michelle's group, are putting their money where their mouth is about sponsoring projects like what DIME's doing, sponsoring multiple cross-industry collaborations, because we know we can't do it alone, and putting, a lot of people on all of these projects across industry to help move that needle together. I think is something that gives me a lot of hope, because we're not competing in this space, knowing that working together is going to be the only way that we're going to make a difference.
I would agree with that and say that people are now admitting that their baby is ugly, that maybe the way you've been doing it for many years hasn't been working and we have to do things differently. And I think there's hope there when you say that. And I love seeing pharma companies working together to solve the problem, to save lives. So I think that's good. I also would add that, we work really hard on our When We Trial program, and it's working. We're seeing women sign up. And so I think just giving basic education to patients and empowering them with information is making pharma work harder. So I think that the fact that if we can educate patients, and I think that there's ways that pharma can work better with advocacy groups like mine to engage patients in these conversations, to educate them, to help them do the work better. So I see hope there.
Yeah, and I'll go so far as to say, coming from the commercial side of our business and working in agencies and so on, that was very cutthroat, very competitive, very, hey, we need to do better. And it was all about the bottom line and the dollar. And coming over to this side of the world, the part that gave me hope is like people like Raquel and all of the different sponsors that I've had a chance to interact with across the board. These are now very friendly groups of, hey, we're going to do this all together. We're linking arms, and that's the way we're moving forward. This team has been incredible to get through and to understand. All of our populations are not going to trust the industry until they see us all working together. And that's a little bit of the tech too, is to be able to see that consistency. But when Amgen wants to go out into the space and say, hey, this is how we do clinical trial diversity and how we conduct our clinical operations, and then the person who's looking at that turns and sees GSK's communications and sees that, oh, I see the similarities. I can understand it's all together. It's not something vastly different. It's not them saying, oh, we do it this way, and them saying we do it differently. It's all unified. That's where it becomes powerful, and that's really how we move forward.
Well, thank you all so much, and thank you all so much for joining this panel, for being here. It's been really really fascinating to have so many diverse perspectives on such an important issue. Before we go, I want to give everyone a chance to give a closing remark or a call to action. If people are going to take one thing away from this panel, what do you want that one thing to be? I can call on you, or people can just jump in when they're ready.
Yeah, this is Dale. I started off with the intros. I'll start off with the closing at this point. I think a key that I would like to leave as a takeaway is that we must understand this has to move away from a transactional model. And that means going further upstream and understanding that we need to engage with the individuals that we ultimately hope to have in our trials. And I think a lot of teams within pharma that have been built, Raquel's team with Amgen, they understand that. But I think within sponsors and pharma, they also need to have that discussion with procurement, budgeting, all the people that are so used to having just-in-time transactional decisions, ClinOps, and get them to also understand the importance of the investment of both time and money to go further upstream, to engage prior to the point of wanting somebody to take part in the trial.
Who wants to go next?
Follow up with Dal. I know Ricky mentioned this before too, but I think it's important from a sponsor perspective to talk about that we understand that this is a lesson and an exercise in humility from the sponsor perspective as well. There's cultural humility, but there's humility in approaching research in a different way than we have in the past. And thinking about how we approach those things, thinking about intersectionality of people's identities is critical as we move forward in this work, because we're dealing with whole people and whole lives. And that's something that we keep front of mind as we work on this issue together.
Yeah, and I'll follow that in terms of, there are elements of things that we have done in the past that we've applied to very complex and challenging problems that we can bring into the sphere as well. But with the recognition that we have to sprinkle in some other elements. There is considerations for history, for culture, for trust, for structural anti-racism that really need to be part of this formula. We've done amazing things as a biomedical community, as a research community, and we can tackle this problem as well, but we can't lose sight of what is different in the lens for when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, and representation. I'm excited to be a part of these types of discussions to help moving forward.
I'll go next. I would say two things. Use the patient voice as a voice of trust, because it works. and practice the golden rule. It always wins.
All right. Ingrid?
I'd say, I agree. I think the committee panel has really raised some important points, but the transparency together, right? Harnessing technology to achieve the outcomes of representation. I think that if we can focus on being transparent together to achieve that representation, using those different tools that Ed was just mentioning, I think that's going to really formulate the next few years, and we'll see impact. We really will see impact.
Yeah, I'll go. And I think my call to action is really just to keep doing more and keep doing what we're doing. I think we saw some good successes come out of COVID and COVID trials and being, more inclusive and engaging more diverse populations, but we don't want that to just end there. We want to keep going and keep doing that in all of our trials and all of the research that we do. So I think it is continuing to keep the momentum and all of us to continue to work together and just keep building from there.
So I'll finish up with holding ourselves accountable. I really don't think that's a scary thing to do, and that goes back and forth. So I can hold my partners accountable, and I can hold my physician PIs accountable, and they can hold us accountable. And let's keep talking, because asking the questions and all the questions that came up in this are fantastic. Don't be afraid.
Well, thank you so much all again. I suppose before I hand it over to Yashoba, I should also thank the Digital Medicine Society for putting this together and for inviting me to come moderate. I really have relished the opportunity to speak with you all. I've certainly learned things I didn't know before. And I think it'll just be really interesting to see how this plays out in terms of the things we talked about from the regulatory and legislative perspective, right? But even if nothing comes of those, or if they don't go the way that we want them to, this group gives me hope that the industry itself will move in this direction. And so thank you all for being a part of that. This is a critically important thing. Diversifying clinical trials is sort of righting a centuries-old wrong in how pharma has done its business. And it means a lot to be part of that work. So thank you all so much for being here and for what you do.
Thank you.
And with that, I'll turn it over to Yashoda.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jonah. And thank you, panelists. I have the honor of working with our panelists in our project, and it has been enlightening just learning from all of your different perspectives and learning from your experiences. That gives me hope. That gives me hope that we can do something. Clearly, we've only just begun, and we could talk about this for hours, but I'm reminded of something that has come up at our project meetings several times. And that is, we have talked about this topic far too long. It's time to take some action. So I'm going to leave you with the call to action to check out the DIME website to learn more about what our project team is doing and to learn more about the resources that we will be launching in February. This group has come together really nicely and done a lot of work to inspire some resources that we know you will be able to take off the shelf and start using in your work immediately. Thank you, Jonah, for joining us today. It's really nice to have your perspective and non-project team members' perspective on this topic and to guide us through these discussions. And thank you, panelists. I'm really grateful that you came today to share your insights with the rest of the DIME community and others who are interested in doing something about diversity in clinical trials. I just want to leave you with some programming notes. Tomorrow, we have a webinar on the state of virtual care. This is going to be led by Lynette Diemers, who is our project director for Impact, the DIMES Virtual Care Initiative. And then we have a journal club on December 7th. And this will be led by Dr. Diana Rofel. And the discussion will be centered on the patient matters in the end point. So with that, in a couple of minutes to get you to your next meeting, I want to thank you all so very much for joining us and for engaging in this discussion. We can only move this forward with all of your help. So I invite you to figure out what you can do today to help advance diversity, equity, and inclusion in clinical trials. And thank you so much for joining.